Say good afternoon, brethren. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Honored to be able to speak to the group today and those who might be on the internet with us also. Thank Mr. Faulkner for giving me this opportunity, inviting me to be with you today. You probably know I'm on my way home from our family reunion. Our family gets together. My wife and I had 4 children, all married, and of course, one locally who married Mr. Faulkner's daughter. That brought us together as one family here. And with his children and my other children's children, let's see, I have 14 grandchildren. So we spent the time with them, and I appreciate the fact that we could all be together for a week and still get along with each other. So I consider that a tremendous blessing anyway. I might mention that Mr. Faulkner and I, of course, have been around a long time in the church, and yet we knew of each other, but we really didn't spend any time together until a few years ago. I think back at that time, if I remember correctly, there were probably 1,600 elders in the church back in those years. So you could be on different parts of the world and different parts of the country and not, of others, but you wouldn't necessarily spend time with them. But then, of course, our kids gave us a trip, an Alaska cruise, and so we spent the cruise together and got to know each other. I'll just mention briefly that I heard the truth over the radio. My parents were listeners, and I, of course, became one as well, because our form of entertainment at that time, other than playing out in the woods, was listening to the radio. We had no television, so we listened to Mr. Armstrong at night, and that was in 1946. So that's when I first heard the truth, and we continued to listen to it for quite a few years. I would say that it was great to know the truth. My parents and my uncle were the ones who believed it. And at that time, we were more hearers than doers. And it took, sadly, quite a few years before we really began to practice it. My cousin on my uncle's side went to college before I did. And I applied to college in 1958, Ambassador College, and I put on my application that I wanted to go out to Pasadena and become a civil engineer. And of course, Pasadena was not giving any civil engineer degrees at that time. So I spent 4 more years in school at home, which is the School of Hard Knocks, and then applied again in 1962, was accepted. I was baptized before going to college by Mr. Gerald Waterhouse. And my mother was the next one in our immediate family that was baptized. Well, my brother was after me. I tried to get my parents to do better obeying God, and I was pushing them like everything, which I shouldn't have been doing. And I didn't care whether my brother was converted or not. And I'm not saying that's the right attitude, but that's the attitude that I had at the time. So he was baptized about 3 months after I was. My mother was baptized 20 years after I was. So a little bit of a history there. I retired from the ministry in 2018, 1918. That's when people say I was born. But in 2018, after 52 years in the ministry, and my wife died of pancreatic cancer 1 year later. So I do want to say that I'm still very active in the church. I do still do writing, speaking. I'm on the doctrine committee, reviewing articles that go out. So I really appreciate staying busy. And I feel that I need to stay busy. It helps with the grief. It helps with, of course, many other things as well, studying, learning, growing spiritually, hopefully. But I do want to stay as active as I can. I told Mr. Horchek when we talked about retiring, and I was 78 years old when I retired, but that I felt like an old gray horse being put out to pasture to die. He said, don't look at it that way. But thankfully, I haven't done that yet. But I'm not afraid of that, but I do want to stay as active as long as I can. So just a little background I would share with you. I hope that is not too boring anyway. But with that, I'll get into the message today. And I'll begin by saying, I know that you share with me as well, I do feel just tremendously blessed. And I know that it's from God. I know that I don't deserve it. I feel like David did. Who am I to have the blessings that I have, to have the physical health? And I may be kidding myself. I think I have mental health too. But to have both at my age is a wonderful blessing. And I'm sure that you also feel very, very blessed. We know God's truth, and that is something very few people in the world know yet. You know about Jesus Christ's return to this earth. You know that you have a purpose in life, and you have hope, which there's less and less hope in the world today because we're living in a world of chaos. And you know how it's going to end. And many people in the world don't know how it's going to end. And it should be very, very encouraging to us to know how it's going to end. It's going to end on a positive note, but we're going to go through some very difficult things before that. We do not live in darkness, but we live in the light of God's truth. And speaking of the light, I know we all want to be a good light to other people. I would share here with you that a lot of the people that come into the church, we know they can't come in unless God calls them. He has to call them before they can know the truth. But calling is only the beginning. People have to respond to the calling, and many don't respond. But God uses the example of members a lot of times to bring people into the knowledge of the truth that he is calling. And so a lot of the people that come into the church, a lot of people that are converted, come in through the example of other people. Now, I've lived in my subdivision at about, I think, I've forgotten, maybe around 60, 70 homes in our subdivision, only one way to get in. But I've lived there 17 years. And I thought, here every Saturday morning, I walk out of my house dressed in a suit, with a Bible in my hand, and I think, well, why doesn't somebody ask me, why are you dressed up on Saturday? And I keep looking around. Nobody asks. 17 years it goes by. Finally, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was walking in the neighborhood and I walked by someone's house. There were a couple of women standing outside, and they said, "Happy Easter." And I said, "Well, happy Passover." And they said, oh, yeah, happy Passover. So that was the best I've done in about 14 to 15 years. And so 17 years has gone by now, actually a little over 17, probably 17 and a half years. And of all things, let me tell you a story here that ties in with this. The people across the street from us were an elderly couple, but they moved away. He'd retired, moved to be closer to his family. And there was a young couple moved in. And they had 2 very small children. She's had 1 since then. So they have 3 children now. And I found out later that they're very good friends with a couple about 2 blocks down the street from them. So I would bump into them occasionally. They'd be out walking, I'd be out walking. And one time I had several extra ears of corn that I couldn't eat it all myself, fresh corn. So I went over and said to her, would you like for your family 3 or 4 ears of corn? I said, I don't need it myself. She said, well, sure, be glad to have it. And so I gave it to her. And once or twice I shared some food. And I guess that's what the sermonette said. We need to feed others. So anyway, I shared some things with them, and I'd see them occasionally on the street. We'd say, "Hi, hello, how are you doing?" And that was nice. And then I see the other couple down the street walking, got speaking friendly with them as well. Well, just about a month ago, I was out walking late afternoon. I take a short walk on the Sabbath at the end of the Sabbath and kind of reflecting and all. And they were out walking, and both couples were out walking, and the ladies with their little ones were a little behind. And I said to the lady, I said, "By the way, I've got a couple of sippy cups for my grandkids, and I don't need them anymore. I know you have small children. Would you like these sippy cups?" She said, "Sure, yeah, we'd like to have them for our babies." And so I said, "Okay, I'll go ahead and get them." Walked on up close to the house. They were out front of in the street, across the street from my house. Went inside, got the sippy cups and 2 baby spoons, gave them to her. And we were chatting. And I said, "Oh, by the way, my wife's clothes are in there, and you look about the same size." So, sermon that said, "Clothe the stranger." So, so I said, "Would you like to look at my wife's clothes?" And we'll be giving them to the thrift store or something. But if you see any you would like, you're welcome to come over and take a look and get whatever you want. So they said, "Well, when can we come over?" It was the end of the day, end of the Sabbath, right at close to sundown. And I had after Sabbath services up in, and the closest church to me is Jefferson, Georgia. So I would come home from church and I'd ask brethren if you'd like to come over and share potluck together and just the afternoon to fellowship. So we had about 23 people in my house after services, just sharing the food and talking, having a little Bible study. Most of them were gone except my oldest daughter and her family. And they said, well, we don't want to come over because you got a big crowd. I said, no, they're all gone, but my family won't be any problem. And the ladies said, well, what we can do is come over in the morning, Sunday morning. And I might mention before that, one of the guys, well, one of the two men down the street said, we really appreciate you out the way you exercise out on the street. So we see you walking a lot, jogging a little bit sometimes. We really admire that. Well, I want to get the topic off of me. So I said to one of the guys, well, you look like you're in good shape. He was slender and all. And his wife said, no, he's not. So I didn't want to argue with that, but anyway, whenever they said, well, we'll come over on Sunday. And then one of the women said, no, we can't come on Sunday. He'll be at church. I said, no, I don't go to church on Sunday. I go today. And one of the men's eyes got real big. You keep Sabbath? I said, well, yes, I've been keeping it a long time. And he said, whoa, he got real excited. He said, how about those days in Leviticus 23? I said, oh, yes, I keep those too. He said, we do too. And we both got real excited. He said, how about those clean and unclean laws? I said, yes, I do that too. He said, we do too. And so it really turned into quite an interesting conversation. And so they told me that they were Romanians, and they were from Romania. And they said that our grandfather fought in World War II. And I don't know whether he fought against the Russians or against the Germans, as the German-Russian clashed there on the Eastern Front. But anyway, he said, his grandfather said, God, if you will get me through this war, I will keep your laws from now on. He said, that's when our family started keeping the Sabbath. And it says it's come down to the third generation. So anyway, that's just part of the conversation. So I felt a little better after 17 years. I could talk to one of the neighbors anyway about keeping God's way of life. But being a light, being an example, of course, is something I think we all hope that we can do, not only to each other, but to those who are not in the faith yet. A little over a month or so ago, I was going over from Georgia to Alabama to attend my grandson's graduation. My oldest daughter's grandson was graduating from high school. And so it was around mid-afternoon. It was very rainy. And I was driving across East Alabama in the misting rain on the way to his graduation when the news came over the radio of an elementary school shooting. It was the first announcement on this particular station in Yuvalda, Texas. And horrible news at that time said that there are probably 11 to 14 elementary children that had been killed. And as I listened to that, I had to fight back the tears to know what some parents must be going through when they were outside, knowing their kids were inside with a shooter. And it seems like, as I know you feel the same way, that every week now there are mass killings somewhere in the U.S. And of course, the final numbers, as we know, turned out to be 19. And then the commentary began on the radio. One said, we must learn from this so that it never happens again. And I thought, how many times have you heard them say, we must learn from this crisis so that it never happens again? And yet it continues to happen. But so we don't really learn as a people. We don't learn as a nation. We blame guns. We blame evil police. We blame liberal judges. We blame racism, or the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, their policies, and ad nauseum, so to speak. And yet the country never hits on what the real problem is. And I'll just share with you, do you know when the worst school deaths deaths of children in school was. Do you know when it was? Anyone know when it was? It was 1927. And at that time, in 1927, and I think it was in Michigan, 45 people were killed in a crisis in school. 38 of those 45 were school children. You know the weapon? The weapon was dynamite. It wasn't guns, it was dynamite. Yeah, and I'm not against, I don't think taking people's guns away would solve the problem. That's not the problem. Those are not the real causes. And I do believe that the real cause is rejection of God and his laws, which is getting worse and worse in the world and in our nation as well. And that rejection of God's laws has led to the destruction of the family, or else the distortion of the family. The family is non-existent, or it is dysfunctional. We have so many fatherless homes. We have what you might call so many free-range children. You've heard free-range chickens. That you buy these eggs are from free-range chickens. Well, they're allowed to range for themselves, and a lot of children range freely without any direction, from their parents today. And which is, as I said, fatherless homes. Both parents are equally important, but the father is so important for both the daughter and the son as they grow up. I certainly think the mother has the greatest influence in the first years of the life of a child, but the father's influence is so important as they begin to get into those years of puberty. Which reminds me, and I'll just interject another story here, that when we arrived with our grandson at the school, he had to go early. The graduates had to go early. And so we sat out in the parking lot. And as we were sitting there at the parking lot, there was a car pulled up beside us. And I saw two people get out. There was a woman and a young man. And they were blacks. I just glanced over at them, and we were sitting there talking. My son-in-law, daughter, and two or three others in the car, granddaughter, and all. And all of a sudden, there was a tap on the window, and I looked over, and the woman was tapping on the window, and I opened the door, and she said, "Could you help my son tie his tie?" And I said, "Well, sure." And so I stepped out, and here was this young black boy, and I don't say that disrespectfully. He was 18 years old, and she hands me his tie, and his shirt is open, got a sport jacket on, and I said, "I'm going to show you how to tie a double Windsor." And so I said, "I've got to tie it on myself because I can't tie it on someone else." So I took the tie and tied it on myself, slipped it over my head, slipped over his head. I said, you're going to have to button the buttons. Let me put it under your collar. And so, I helped him, and the mother was standing there. She was very thankful. And finally, he got his tie. But I thought later, this young man probably didn't have a father that would teach him how to tie his tie. He probably didn't have a father at home that would teach him the things that a father should teach a son. And it was sad. And that was probably happens far more, as we know it does, far more than we might even realize. But it was an interesting experience in that evening anyway. So we know that there are many, many chaotic, horrible things that are happening in our world today. And it's no wonder that God's prophet Malachi spoke of turning back the heart of the children to their fathers and the fathers to their children. So 19 children at that point, that evening that I was standing there, and we asked, would it happen again? Well, sadly, we know that it will, and it has, because 2 Timothy 3 says that evil men and impostors will grow worse and worse. I'd like to turn over now to Zechariah chapter 7, and let's read verses 9 through 12. Of course, this is a prophecy that God spoke through the prophet Zechariah, but we know there's duality. Obviously, it was important to the people at his time, but God recorded it for us in our time. as down through history. It's typical of human nature. Let's begin in verse 9. Thus says the Lord of hosts, execute true justice. And we know that that isn't very prevalent today. Show mercy and compassion, everyone to his brother. Do not oppress the widow and the fatherless, the alien or the poor. Let none of you plan evil in his heart against his brother. But they refused to heed, shrugged their shoulders, and stopped their ears so that they could not hear. Yes, they made their hearts like flint, refusing to hear the law and the words which the Lord of hosts has spoke by his Spirit through the former prophets. Thus, great wrath came upon the Lord of hosts. And so, as a result of turning away from God, we know that God removes his protection, and sadly, then bad things begin to happen as Satan has more freedom to act, which he will and have for a short time here in these last days. But people seem to be more interested in things like the trial of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard than they do of some of the more important things that are happening in life. I want to turn now to Jeremiah, and I'm going to give you a couple other scriptures for the sake of time. I won't go to them, but if you choose to study later, you can go to these. And one would be Lamentations 3:48 and 49, and Jeremiah 4:31. These scriptures show the grief that comes upon a nation, and the nation of Israel, who has turned away from God. And I'm going to go now to Jeremiah 31 and verse 15. I just recently started using a tablet to turn to the scriptures as the same words that's in the Bible. So it is inspired words of God. And you might remember this was quoted a number of years ago when the planes crashed into the towers in New York. Thus says the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children because they are no more. We can't imagine the grief of those parents who lost their children in Yuvalda, and not just there, but many other schools and places, and of course on the streets of many of the cities. And how do you comfort someone that's lost their children? Mr. Faulkner and I don't know your history, but we lost our wives, and you don't know what it's like until you go through it yourself. It's just like a part of you is torn from you, and it is very difficult to be comforted, and it must be equally as hard, or maybe even more so, to lose a child who didn't have its opportunity to live its life here. So as I drove that afternoon towards Sam's graduation, I hurt for those moms and dads, and just imagining the pain, the loss that they would feel, or they did feel. And I want to toss out a little question here, and I'll come back to it later. If you could speak to a room full of the parents or grandparents of those 19 children that were murdered in Yuvalda, what would you say to them? If you were given the opportunity to speak to those parents or grandparents, what would you say to them? Well, later that evening, as we went into the auditorium, and as I sat and listened to speeches in an auditorium of more than 1,000 people, I asked myself another question. If I were asked to speak to those graduating seniors, what would I say to the graduating seniors? So what could you say to those 19 kids to comfort their parents, the parents of those 19 kids? If you were asked to speak to the group in the auditorium of the high school graduates and their parents, what would you say to them? Again, I'm going to come back to these questions and tell you some of what I would say. And I'm not saying that what I would say would be the best thing, but at least it's something that came to my mind. And I think those who are young people today, and all of us, know that we're growing up in an evil and dangerous world. And when I was in school, when I was in elementary school, and we drilled in classes, some of you might remember this, maybe not. We drilled in the case of an atomic bomb attack. And we would march out of the classrooms into the hallway, and we would all squat down right next to the wall, the cement wall in the hallway. So we drilled in case of an atomic attack, because that was the time after World War II when Russia had developed the atomic bomb as well, and we saw them as a great threat. But today, children today have in schools lockdown drills. Lockdown drills is what they're called. And they're finding these children who are going through lockdown drills are being traumatized by the drills. And so they fear that it is adding to the already high suicide rate among our children. So that evening, as we drove to Pelham, Alabama, in the auditorium there for graduation of around 236 grads and probably over 1,000 family and friends that were there, before the diplomas came the speeches, which I imagine the seniors paid little attention to. They're probably saying, let's get this over with. I want to get my diploma. I've got to listen to these speeches. But anyway, we had those speeches. And I might ask you, how many of you remember, and if you do, I'd like you to raise your hand. How many of you remember your first grade teacher? Is anyone, no one here? Well, several of you remember. It's a long time ago, but I remember my first grade, second grade teacher. How many of you remember the speeches of your high school graduation? We have one. So I think more people remember the names of their teachers than they remember what was covered in the graduation speeches anyway, especially by their classmates. But the speeches, as I sat there, were disappointing. The valedictorian, the salutatorian were girls. My grandson was number 3, so just a fraction of a point, he missed being one of those anyway. But anyway, I remember one of the girls who was giving her speech, she stood up and said, I just have so much compassion of other people. She says, I don't know whether I was born with it or I learned it as I was growing up. And she was telling just how she somehow was just so filled with compassion for others. And she was just so glad that she was compassionate. And I could see some of the teens knew her in school and they didn't really buy into it. They thought they knew her personally. And she wasn't that popular among a lot of the kids. And my granddaughter attends that school. And so she shared that with me also. Not necessarily that she should have, but then after her speech on how awesome her compassion was, a lady who was a teacher also stood up to give, the final commencement address. And she made this statement, which is made so often in graduation speeches. I'm sure you'll recognize it. You can change the world. And so that's, no, she started this way. She says, today is the beginning of your life. You can go out of here and change the world. I thought, how many times has that been said to 17, 18-year-olds? That today is the beginning of your life. You can go out and change the world. And I thought to myself, no, they can't. These 18-year-olds cannot go out and change the world. They can't stop the disease, the pandemics. They can't end starvation that's going on in Ethiopia and Sudan and many other places in the world. They can't cause Putin, to end his invasion of the Ukraine. These 18-year-olds can't stop the Jews and Arabs from hating each other and cause them to start to love one another. So you could go on and on of the things they can't do. I would not say that to them, because it's not true. No physical human being can change the world. I'd say to them, you graduating seniors, you cannot change the world. Only God can, and in time he will. I'd tell them that this is an evil and dangerous world out there, and you're going out into it. And the question is, as a young person, will you let the world change you or ruin you or destroy you? Or will you stand above, the perversity and the evil that is in the world? And I would tell them at this age that from now on, most of you won't have your parents beside you all the time to guide you. And I tell them that this is not the beginning of your life. Your life began 18 years ago, and the values and the principles that you learned then in those early years will determine how you handle the temptations and the trials that you will face. For you will have to make choices with every choice comes consequences, be they good or they're bad. And I tell them that their choices will determine your quality of life, your success, your happiness, and in some cases, your choices will determine the length of your life. Those are some of the things that I would say to them if I was speaking to a group of graduates. Some of you will have heard the commencement address given by Admiral William McRaven. And he said, if you want to change the world, make your bed every morning. You know, and I think he had 10 points that if you want to change the world, here's where you begin. And it was an interesting speech that he gave at that time. I looked at it. He was a Navy SEAL. And I want to say that the best that I have ever heard was given by a Supreme Court Justice, John Roberts, to a 9th grade graduating class. And, you know, I'm not here to judge the judges. God has said some, well, I shouldn't say God, but some people have said good things, even a donkey. You know, if you don't believe it, look back in the Old Testament. So if you would indulge me, I'd like to share here his words. And I think you'll find it inspiring, and I think you would find it helpful, and especially any young people that might, and parents as well, that might be, have children that are growing toward this point in their life. And I'll begin after, as he got into his ceremony. He says, before we go any further, graduates, he says, you have an important task to perform because behind you are your parents and guardians. 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, they drove into Cardigan. Cardigan was the name of the elementary, the school, the middle school, and dropped you off, helped you get settled, and then turned around and drove back out of the gates. It was an extraordinary sacrifice for them. They drove down the trail of tears back to an emptier and lonelier house. They did that because the decision about your education they knew was about you. It was not about them. The sacrifice and others they have made brought you to this point. But this morning is not just about you. It's also about them. So I hope you will stand up and turn around and give them a great round of applause, please. And so then he says, now, when somebody asked me how the remarks at Cardigan went, I was able to say they were interrupted by an applause. So he says, congratulations, class of 2017. You've reached an important milestone, an important stage in your life is behind you. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you it is the easiest stage of your life, but it is in the books. And while you've been at Cardigan, you've been a part of an important international community. And I think that needs to be particularly recognized. And he says, now around the country today at colleges, high school, middle schools, commencement speakers are standing before them patient graduates. And they're almost always saying the same things that they will say today, that today is a commencement exercise. It's the beginning, not the end. You should look forward. I think that's true enough. However, I think if you're going to look forward to figure out where you're going, it's good to know where you've been and to look back as well. And I think if you look back to your first afternoon here at Cardigan, perhaps you will recall that you were lonely. Perhaps you will recall that you were a little scared, a little anxious. And now look at you. You're surrounded by friends you call brothers, and you're confident in facing the next step in your education. It is worth trying to think, why is that so? And when you do, I think you may appreciate that it was because of the support of your classmates in the classroom, on the athletic field, and in the dorms. And as far as the confidence goes, I think you will appreciate that it's not because you succeeded at everything you did, but because with the help of your friends, you were not afraid to fail. And if you did fail, you got up and tried again. And if you failed again, you got up and tried again. And if you failed again, it might be time to think about doing something else. But it's not just success, but not being afraid to fail that brought you to this point. Now, the commencement speakers will typically also wish you good luck and extend good wishes to you. I will not do that, and I'll tell you why. From time to time, in the years to come, I hope you will be treated unfairly, so that you will come to know the value of justice. I hope that you'll suffer betrayal, because that will teach you the importance of loyalty. Sorry to say, but I hope you'll be lonely at times. from time to time so that you'll not take your friends for granted. I wish you bad luck from time to time so that you'll be conscious of the role of chance in life and understand that your success is not completely deserved and that the failure of others is not completely deserved either. And when you lose, as you will from time to time, I hope every now and then your opponent will gloat over your failure. It's a way for you to understand the importance of sportsmanship. I hope you'll be ignored so that you'll know the importance of listening to others. And I hope you will have just enough pain to learn compassion. Whether I wish these things or not, they're going to happen. And whether you benefit from them or not will depend upon your ability to see the message in your misfortunes. Now, commencement speakers are also expected to give some advice. They give grand advice, and they give some useful tips. The most common grand advice they give is for you to be yourself. It is an odd piece of advice to give people dressed identically. But you should be yourself, but you should understand what that means. Unless you're perfect, it does not mean don't make any changes. In a certain sense, you should not be yourself. You should try to become something better. Perhaps people say be yourself because they want you to resist the impulse to conform to what others want you to be, but you can't be yourself if you don't learn who you are. You can't learn who you are unless you think about it. The Greek philosopher Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And while just do it might be a good motto for some things, it's not a good motto when you're trying to figure out how to live your life that is before you. And one important clue to living a good life is not to try to live the good life. The best way to lose the values that are central to who you are, frankly, is not to think about them at all. So that's the deep advice. Now, some tips as you get ready to go out to your new school. Over the last couple of years, I've gotten to know many of you young men pretty well, and I know you're good guys. But you're also privileged young men. And you weren't privileged when you came here. You're privileged now because you've been here. My advice is don't act like it. When you get to your new school, walk up and introduce yourself to the person who's raking the leaves, shoveling the snow, or emptying the trash. Learn their names and call them by their name during your time at school. Another piece of advice, when you pass by people you don't recognize on the walk, smile, look them in the eye and say hello. The worst thing that will happen is that they will you'll become known as the young man who smiles and says hello, and that's not a bad thing to start with. You've been at a school with just boys. Most of you will be going to school with girls. I have no advice for you. The last bit of advice I'll give you is very simple, but I think it could make a big difference in your life. Once a week, you should write a note to someone, not an email, a note on a piece of paper. It will take exactly 10 minutes. Talk to an adult. Let them tell you what a stamp is. You can put the stamp on the envelope, again, 10 minutes once a week, and I'll help you right now. I will dictate to you the first note you should write. It will say, dear, and you fill in the name of a teacher at this school, and then say, I've started at this new school. We're beginning to blank, read in English, football, soccer practice, but I'm enjoying it. Thank you for teaching me. Put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it. It will mean a great deal to people who, for reasons most of us cannot contemplate, have dedicated themselves to teaching middle school boys. As I said, that it will take exactly 10 minutes a week. By the end of the school year, you will have sent notes to 40 people. 40 people will feel a little more special because you did, and they will think you're very special because of what you did. No one else is going to carry that dividend during your time at school. Enough advice. I would like to end by reading some important lyrics. I cited the Greek philosopher Socrates earlier. These lyrics are from the great American philosopher, Bob Dylan. They're almost 50 years old. He wrote them for his son, Jesse, who he was missing while he was on tour. It lists the hopes that a parent might have for a son and a daughter. They're also good goals for a son and a daughter. The wishes are beautiful. They're timeless. They're universal. They're good and true, except for one. It is the wish that gives the song its title and its refrain. That wish is a parent's lament. It's not a good wish. So these are the lyrics from Forever Young. And I'm not saying that I agree with all that's in this that he said. Keep that in mind. I don't necessarily agree, but it is interesting to listen to it. Here's what it is. May God bless you and keep you always. May your wishes all come true. Be always do for others and let others do for you. May you build a ladder to the stars and climb on every rung, and may you stay forever young. May you grow up to be righteous. May you grow up to be true. May you always know the truth and see the light surrounding you. May you always be courageous, stand upright and be strong, and may you stay forever young. And then finally here, may your hands always be busy. May your feet always be swift. May you have a strong foundation when the winds or changes shift. May your heart always be joyful. May your song always be sung, and may you stay forever young. A lot of good points. That's the way he ended his. And I think we could say that certainly a lot of those tie in with what we know God would want of us anyway. But as we look around us today and see the violence and mass killings increase, people say something is terribly wrong. And you've probably heard people say that. Has been talking on the news. I've heard people say, something is wrong. And maybe out in the public as you talk to people, something is wrong. And they don't know what is wrong. And of course, they don't have the answers. They cry out for answers. I know when President Biden visited Yuvalda, Texas, I think I saw as he was getting in the car, the crowd starting chanting to him, do something, do something, do something. And so, that was what they were chanting as he left the area. But what could he or anyone do really? What is the answer? What is the solution? Well, the answer, the solution ties in not only with this day today, the Sabbath day, but God's holy days as well. And there is no other answer. Our leaders, our influencers, who are the influencers in our world today? And I could say here, what is leadership? Well, one person defined leadership as influence. And so who are the influencers? Obviously it's the entertainment world, it's politicians, and of course, entertainment would include Hollywood, the singers, and they're four, and certainly the one that is should be an influencer would be the churches. And yet the churches are so concerned about being politically correct, they're not willing to condemn what is wrong. In fact, they reject. We know what God says is wrong and are becoming tolerant of those things as well. So we know they don't have the answer, and they'll try everything but God's way, and the violence will continue to get worse. And the solution is in a promise extended, and that is the pouring out of God's Spirit. Christ told his disciples, the 12, to tarry, to wait in Jerusalem for the promise. You've all read that in the book of Luke. Wait there for the promise. We know that on the day of Pentecost, that promise was fulfilled for a few, but it was only the beginning. And they and you, we know, those people and you and I are only the first fruits. So I'd like to now go to Joel chapter 2, because in Acts 2, the promise there that they were waiting on and was quoted in Acts chapter 2 when the Spirit was poured out was quoting from Joel 2. And let's take a look at Joel 2 and just notice a couple things here. Joel 2, and I'm going to read verse 1, 15 through 17, and then another verse. He says in Joel 2, blow the trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is close, it is at hand. Again, we know the day of the Lord, and these prophecies there's duality in them. We'll obviously see that as we drop down to verse 15. In verse 15, he says, blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and nursing babies. Let the bridegroom go up from his chamber, let the bride from her dressing room. Let the priest who minister to the Lord weep between the porch and the altar. Let them say, spare your people, O Lord, do not give your heritage to reproach. And so here God's people are going to be praying. We're going to be praying. We'll have compassion for our elders. We'll have compassion for people who are not in the truth, like the people in Yuvalda. We don't just ignore that because they're not a part of the church. We weep with them, and that's the way we should. Weep between the porch and the altar. Let them say, spare your people, O Lord. Do not give your heritage to reproach, that the nation should rule over them Why should they say among the peoples, where is their God? And let's drop down now to verse 28. In verse 28, and he says, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. And so here, I want you to notice that he said on all flesh. And in the book of Acts, it wasn't on all flesh. It was a forerunner, of course, because God, for a certain number of years, would be working through a called out group of people, like he was wanting to work through Israel to be a light and example to the rest of the world, but they failed. And now he's called a spiritual Israel, to carry out the commission. And so, but it was only poured out upon a few people, comparatively speaking. But there's coming a time that God is going to pour out his spirit on all flesh, or he'll make it available for all flesh of all nations, races, all countries, ultimately. And it'll start, of course, with Israel and the Jewish people, as we know from prophecies. And after we as a people, as a nation, have been humbled, it will then, and only then, when the Spirit is poured out with what is this violence that's going on in the world, the hatred and things that are taking place, will cease only at that time, because it will result in the changing of the nature of people. Let's go to the book of Ezekiel. I'm going to go to Ezekiel and verse 36, and let's begin reading in verse 9 through 14. We'll begin with here. He says, for indeed I am for you, and I will turn to you, and you shall be tilled and sown. He's talking, as we see in verse 6, to the land of Israel, and it's in the future. And I will turn to you, and you shall be tilled and sown. I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, all of it. And the cities shall be inhabited, and the ruins rebuilt, you after the great tribulation. Now multiply you upon you man and beast, and they shall increase and bear young. I'll make you inhabited as in former times, and do better for you than at your beginnings. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. Yes, I'll cause men to walk in you, my people Israel. They shall take possession of you. You got to go through some hard times to be awakened and be humbled, and you shall be their inheritance. No more shall you bereave them of children. And it's sad that many of the targets are children, and our people are being bereaved of their children. Thus saith the Lord God, because they say to you, you devour men and bereave your nation of children. That is, the land of Israel has become a land that devours its children. That's what some of the one of the spies said about going in there, because of the enemy that was there. Therefore you shall devour men no more, nor bereave your nation anymore, says the Lord God. So here's a prophecy of the future. And let's drop down now to verse 26 of the same chapter. In verse 26, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And so a heart of stone cannot be written on, but a heart of flesh will be soft and pliable and be teachable. And so finally our people will be teachable to realize that we don't have the answers. Everything we've tried hasn't worked. And so God will humble us, and our people as a nation will become teachable. And then he says in verse 27, I'll put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will keep my judgments and do them. And then in verse 28, then you shall dwell in the land that I gave you, your fathers, you shall be my people, and I will be your God. I want to go back in Ezekiel here to chapter 18. Again, an interesting couple scriptures here we'll look at today with this in Ezekiel 18. And just a couple scriptures. We'll look at verse 31 and 32. 31 and 32. He says, cast away from you all the transgressions which you've committed, and get yourselves a new heart and a new spirit. For why should you die, O house of Israel? For I have no pleasure in the death of the one who dies, said the Lord God. Therefore turn and live. Turn, of course, means to repent. But it says, get yourself a new heart. That we have our part to do. People have their part to do. And we know that Jeremiah said the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. And we're seeing that sickness today in people more than ever. in the world we live in that is so horribly influenced by things that take away people's love for others, love of what's right, principles, values. So and he goes on to say, of course, in Jeremiah, who can know it? In other words, who can understand it? So the sick heart of man will finally be healed by God's Spirit. And then the laws of God will be written on those those hearts. And maybe I shouldn't take the time to go to Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 32, he talks about that. The prophet Isaiah talks about that as well. And we know from 2 Timothy 1:7 that it says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And there's so many people that don't have a sound mind. And the word sound mind, in some places there in Timothy and Titus, talks about a healthy mind. The scripture actually, in some of those places, it's a healthy mind. And with God's healing spirit, the mind will become healthy. And that's one thing in my life. I grew up in this world. I didn't grow up in a family that was in God's church. I grew up in the world, and still to some degree, the world affects us. And for those first 20 years of my life, I was corrupted by the world, and you don't get rid of that corruption overnight. And I prayed that God would heal me over and over. I pray that of the corruption that is still in my mind. But let's get back to, as we bring this to a close here, what would I say to those parents? I told you what some of the things I would like to say to the graduating class. What would I say to those parents? I don't know what you really could say, but if you give it a try, here are some of the things, the thoughts that came to my mind. I would tell them, and like many of the other pastors, I don't know how many funerals that I've preached, and I've never enjoyed preaching a funeral, that because of the sadness, but I do enjoy teaching God's truth. But what would I say to those parents? I'd say that I am so sorry for what you're going through now. And I know that you won't understand this yet, but God promises to do something that you at the moment will think is impossible. And that is, he's going to turn your sorrow into joy. It says those who mourn will be comforted, and will tell them about the second resurrection. And I say, I want you to know that your little babies are sleeping peacefully now, and God is going to bring them back to life, just as he will you in years to come. And at that time, when he brings you back to life and he brings them back to life, you'll be able to hold them in your arms, and you'll be able to be their parents and finish your rearing of those children. I know that it'll be difficult for you to understand that, but please keep that in mind. That's what our Creator God tells us in his word. Let's go to Psalm, and we'll end here. Psalm 126. Psalm 126, and I want to read verses 5 and 6. He says, those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. He who continually goes forth weeping, bearing seed for sowing, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. And when you're at the height of your grief, it's hard to understand what this is saying here. It's hard, it is not what it's saying, but it's hard to comprehend that this is really going to happen. And so when we're at a loss, when we've lost someone that we love so deeply, we think, how could it ever be better again? How could it ever be good again? And, those are thoughts that came through my mind. But I trust God, and I'll just share a personal thought with you. When I lost my wife, I'd always thought, I was 4 years older than her, that I would go before she did. And I thought that's the way it should be, but it didn't happen that way. And I knew the scriptures, and I read the book of Ephesians that night when they took her away. And there's so many encouraging things in the book of Ezekiel. I'm sorry, in Ephesians, as well as many other places, of course. But God's word tells me that the future will be better than anything we've had in this life. And my initial thought was, because, and maybe I could share another story with you. My wife had gone to the same doctor, urologist, that I went to later. And I told him that he'd treated her. And I said, I lost her that after 53 years of marriage. He says, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And I said, it wasn't just 53 years of marriage, it was 53 good years. And he took my hand in his hand, and he was Chinese. He took my hand in his two hands and he looked at me and says, "At least you had her 53 years. And I thought, wow, that's a different way of looking at it. I thought of what I'd lost. I should think also of what I'd been given. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And as I mentioned, that God's word says what's coming, and my initial is better than what we have in this life. And my initial thought was, how could it be better than what we had? But I totally believe that it will be better because I trust him. I never blame God. He knows what he's doing. I don't always know, but I know that he knows. And so I trust him, and I'm looking forward to that which is better. So it'll be something. And here, and I'll just mention something in Isaiah 54:13 says, great shall be the peace of your children. And won't it be something when those parents are reunited with those same children? And though things are happening that make people question, where's God? Or is there a God? But you and I know that Satan isn't winning. God's plan isn't failing. In Romans 11, it says the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, which is in the context in writing and saying to the Jewish people, they might say, well, look what God promised us Jewish people, and look where we are now. We're not on top of everything. We're down real low. So God promised big things for us. So is God's plan working for us? And they might say, no, it's not. But we know that it is. They are irrevocable, that they had rejected the Messiah. The promises made to their forefathers weren't being fulfilled for them at that time, but it would be in the future. Because of the gift of God's Spirit, you and I are children of light. And there's coming a time that darkness will be taken away from the whole world, and the same Spirit that comforts and leads into all truth will do the same for all of mankind. And that's his promise, and that's a good reason to pray, may thy kingdom come.
And at the end of services, we end with the Aaronic Blessing. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, speak unto Aaron and unto his sons, saying, unto this wise you shall bless the children of Israel, saying unto them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. With that, we'll have a closing song.